This video is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. Hello everyone, my name is Ziamaro and welcome to Battlerite Sage. So today we continue our two-part series on buffs and debuffs. Before I start, I want to thank everyone for their comments on yesterday's video. I knew I would miss stuff, totally forgot Paloma had a stun on her ult right, but in my defense, that right is so rarely picked that it may as well not be there. Paloma main, by the way. I've also been told that Rukan's ultimate is a self-cleanse just like Pestilus's ult, so I'd be interested to hear if there are more self-cleansing ults, or maybe it's just the transformation ultimates that do it. Some people also mentioned that Alicia's ice block doesn't cleanse dots. I haven't actually had a chance to test that, but I know firsthand that it can cleanse other things like blinds. Just like with the previous video, I did get some help from you guys, but I can guarantee there will still be some stuff missing, so keep up the great comments on this one too. So today we're talking about buffs. Buffs are the opposite of debuffs. I don't think there's much explanation required here, but a buff is a status effect that gives you some kind of benefit. It could be a stat boost like attack speed or a damage amp, or it could be a protective buff like damage reduction or a shield. First, let's take a look at which abilities can actually remove buffs. Unlike cleanses, which quite a few champions have access to, the ability to purge buffs is much more rare. And if I'm not mistaken, there are only two champions in the game who can purge, Ivor and Lucy. Lucy's purge comes from Clarity Potion, which is an innate part of her kit, while Ivor's purge comes from a Battlerite for her E ability. It's not the most commonly picked Battlerite, so you won't always see Ivor's take it. And while purges are insanely powerful, Ivor's purge is a lot more situational than Lucy's. In order for Ivor to purge, she needs to actually hit her E ability, which can be countered. Likewise, if the enemy's immaterial, she can't hit her E, so she can't purge. It can be very useful against shield comps though. You know those Freyas who manage to stack up seemingly infinite shields? Yeah, well, Ivor can remove that, so in some situations it can work really well. Lucy's Clarity Potion, on the other hand, is a lot more versatile, and is actually part of what makes Lucy so strong in the right hands. The ability to take Croak out of stealth, remove Shifu's immaterial, or purge Alicia's ice block is insanely powerful. It does take some good game sense and prediction to remove those buffs in a timely manner, but in the hands of an experienced player, Lucy can absolutely destroy some of the strongest champions in this game. So with that in mind, let's move on to which buffs there are in this game for you to purge, starting with attack speed. Okay, so I kind of debated you with this one, because attack speed can't always be purged, but it is a buff that a few champions have access to. For some champions like Rook, Bako, Ivor and Freya, their attack speed comes from a buff that can be purged. On the other hand, Croak and Esmo's attack speed is not attached to a purgeable buff. Rook and Croak's attack speed is part of their base kit, while all the others gain access to it through Battlerites. So let's move on to the next buff, Damage Amp. Now, you may remember this one from yesterday because there are quite a few damage amp debuffs, but there are actually a few damage amp buffs too. One of the most common ones you'll see is from Lucy's Stimulant Battlerite. This makes her heal over time portion of her right clicks also apply a damage amp. Ulrich is the other one you'll see quite often. This damage amp comes from picking up the shield he throws when he uses his ultimate. It also applies a movement speed buff, which we'll get into in a minute. Another fairly common damage amp actually comes from Pearl's Tasty Fishy Battlerite, and that's a Battlerite you'll probably see in 2v2 quite often. There are a few other champions who have access to damage amps, but they're rarely picked. You'll sometimes see Varesh with it, but Blossom, Pestilus, Sirius and Older all have access to a damage amp, but almost never take it. And as I've already mentioned it, let's move on to Haste. Haste is just the name that we give to movement speed buffs in Battlerite. Quite a few champions have access to Haste, but the most obvious one is Taya, because her whole kit is pretty much built around speeding all over the place. Other champions who have access to Haste buffs either through their base kit or commonly picked Battlerites include Bako, Rook, Ivor, Destiny, and as I mentioned before, Ulrich. Blossom never used to have much haste in her common builds, but it's something you'll see pretty often now. While Pearl can get haste from a Battlerite, but it's almost never taken. And similar to Snares, Haste also has a fading version, so we'll take a look at that. The difference with fading haste is, well, I mean, it's kind of obvious. The effect gradually fades over time. In practice, when you apply fading haste, you should probably make the most out of it when you first apply it, because obviously it's going to fade over time. Fading haste seems to be more of a ranged DPS thing, but Raigon and Rukan do have access to it, although those Battlerites are rarely picked. Some examples of fading haste are Jade's Stealth, Iva's blast shield, and Alicia's figure skating. As I mentioned before, Pearl has a haste Battlerite. It gives you a standard haste while walking through a bubble, and that haste fades after you leave the bubble, so it's kind of both. Now let's move on to some of the defensive buffs, starting with Fortify. Apparently, damage reduction buffs are collectively referred to as Fortify. I didn't know that, but apparently it's a thing. There are a few champions who have access to damage reduction buffs. Bako, Croak, and Paloma gain access to Fortify via Battlerites, while Xander has it as a standard part of his kit. Ulrich used to have access to a Fortify effect, but that was quickly removed. It's also worth mentioning that the only damage reduction that can't be purged is Paloma's Phantasm. Next up we have HOTS. HOTS are heal over time effects, and they do exactly what it sounds like. They heal over time. Rook, Blossom, Alicia, Lucy, and Pestilus all get heal over time buffs in their base kit. Thorn and Croak do have access to HOTS, but it technically comes from a debuff that they apply to enemies. They're leeching effects, really. Xander also has access to a heal over time, but it comes from a pretty commonly picked Battlerite. I've also highlighted Alder here, but his buff is actually a delayed heal buff. But for simplicity, I've just included it with heal over times because it functions in a similar-ish way. Carrying on with the defensive buffs, let's look at shields. A lot of champions have access to shields, so I won't be able to mention all of them. Some shields are abilities that you can cast on your allies, such as Lucy's Barrier, Pearl's Bubble Shield, or Iva's Zap. Some shields can be applied to all teammates in an area, such as Bako's R or Ulrich's EXQ. Others are self-shields, like Shifu and Taya's ultimates, or Freya's many ways of applying self-shields. And then we have some weird shields, like Thorn's Husk and Alicia's Ice Block. They both do apply shields, but they have other effects baked in. Next, let's take a look at something that isn't often thought of as a buff: reflects and absorbs. Reflects are things like Bako's Bulwark or Raigon's Parry, while absorbs include Esmo's Arcane Barrier, Ulrich's Radiant Shield, and Rukan's Consume. Alder also has a kinda hybrid absorb reflect with his Time Bender. All the ones I've just mentioned are buffs and can be purged, which is why I've included this category in the video. There are also some reflects and absorbs like Ashka's Firewall or Alder's EXQ, but these are spawned objects and they aren't purgeable, although they have pretty much the same effect. I've also included projectile slows like Pearl's Bubble and Destiny's Wall because they function in a similar way too. Like I said, they're not technically buffs, but just for the sake of completion, I included them. Next, we have Immaterial. This is a pretty uncommon buff. Paloma, Jamong, Shifu, and Jamila all have access to this buff. Immaterial makes you immune to all damage for the duration, so it kinda acts like a pseudo iframe to avoid damage. But because it's a buff, it can be purged, so it's not a true iframe. In the case of Paloma and Jamila, they both have access to a secondary effect during their Immaterial, which is our final buff. Invisibility. This is a buff that causes a lot of frustration for some players. Invisibility can be quite a controversial mechanic in any game. Personally, I've never had much of a problem with it, but I know it can be a bone of contention for many people. Croak, Jade, Blossom, and Jamila all have access to invisibility in their base kit, while Paloma can gain access to invisibility with a commonly used Battlerite. Thorn can also take a Battlerite that makes him invisible during his burrow. First of all, it's pretty uncommon, and secondly, because he goes invisible during an iframe, it's not actually purgeable. So that just about does it for the major kinds of buffs. As with debuffs, there are some weird miscellaneous effects. These include things like Rook's invulnerability while Berserk. Another one is Ulrich's Favor that boosts his healing output on anyone with the Favor buff. So let me know if there are any other weird buffs that I've missed out. You could also consider things like iframes, counters, and mouse 1 stacks to be buffs, because they do offer beneficial effects, but because they're not purgeable, I haven't actually included them. But maybe we can talk about them another time. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please feel free to subscribe for more Battlerite guides, news, and discussion. If you'd like to help support the channel and get some unique rewards, then head over to patreon.com/battleritesage. And don't forget to check out twitch.tv/battleritesage. Until next time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.